I am really excited to share with you this kind of introductory discussion of metaphor in the Hebrew Bible. And I should say straight up front that one of the first things that I say, I've spent an unreasonable amount of my adult life studying ancient Hebrew. And so people legitimately ask me why, right? What led me to do that? And my first response is always that I have been drawn to the Hebrew language ever since first being exposed to it as an undergraduate student, because it is an image-driven language. I love that. I love that we think in pictures as humans, and I'm drawn to languages where the language structure itself really mirrors that. And so I say up front that I am interested in this topic because I really love the image-driven nature of the Hebrew language. And I suppose I could start today by reading a quote that is often attributed to Aristotle. Aristotle is said to have said or written that the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is a sign of genius, since good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars. So I can't tell you for sure what Aristotle would have said in response to the metaphor usage in the Hebrew Bible, but I can tell you that the Hebrew Bible, the authors, let's say the authors collected together in the Hebrew Bible were masters of metaphor. And so I want to start by, let's see if I can figure out how to forward my slides. Okay, there we go. I want to start, before I say too much more, with a short exercise. And maybe I would ask everyone to take a moment and just reflect on these two questions in the sense of, see if you can allow yourself to notice what your very first automatic response is. So if I say, what is the metaphor for God you have heard used the most often? What is the very first thing that comes to mind? And if anyone would like to, I'm always up for waterfall chats, where a whole bunch of people type something into the chat and we just see what it is. So if anyone is up for typing their answer into the chat, I'd be interested in a group this size. What metaphors for God, right? God is my rock. God is my father. God is this or that. What is the metaphor you have heard most often? And when I talk about metaphor, technically metaphor means transference. So it means to speak of one thing in terms of another, not that they're equivalent, but that you're talking about one in terms of the other. And I am using the term sometimes in that very specific sense, but I also think that the discussion that I am opening up for us today is applicable to more broadly the use of imagery in the Hebrew Bible. So besides just God is my rock, but other aspects of the text that talk about reality, who is God, the divine human relationship, how do humans live well, all of these things in terms of images. And the other thing that I would say is I'm speaking about metaphor in a broad enough way to encapsulate drawing parts of the text that draw on metaphor by the use of verbs. Okay, so sometimes it's not going to be a phrase like God is my rock. Sometimes it's going to be verbs. You could think, for instance, of the way God is portrayed in the opening chapters of Genesis. There's the booming voice from above that causes, the created world to come into being and to find order, right? Have order there. And then there's the in the very next chapter, you have this picture, you know, the hands of God shaping the earth. And so sometimes the metaphors and the imagery is coming through in uses of verbs and other ways. It doesn't have to be a specific phrase like God is my rock or God is my father. Okay, so let me, Lauren is already pointing out, right, that father might be the most common one, but maybe not the most effective one for some people. And that, thank you for getting us thinking about that right from the beginning. So I also want to ask you to reflect, right, as we begin here, what is a metaphor for God that in your journey you have found most meaningful or healing or helpful? And this question is really, like I've done this exercise with maybe 100 people in a room at a time, and it usually brings up two things that I think are worth noticing. One is that if you were to physically, if we were all, I can't see how many of us there are right now, but when I looked a few minutes ago, there were about 80 of us. And if we were to all physically take a Post-it note and to answer the one question and put all of those up in one section, and then to answer the other question, what you invariably see is that there's a whole lot more variety in answer to the question of what metaphor for God do you find personally most meaningful, healing, or helpful in comparison to the most common ones. So we have generally been exposed to particular metaphors, very few, right? Usually the most common answers to that question of are father or shepherd. I'm kind of trying to scroll back through and see how that compares with what this group typed in the chat. Yeah, those are probably the ones that come up most often. So usually if there's a group of people, the most common examples that will be typed in will be father and shepherd. So I invite you to keep in mind your responses to these two questions as we continue our conversation this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're listening in from. So I want to read this short quote and give you a couple of examples. Susan Neidich, who writes beautifully about the Hebrew Bible, says that the experiential shimmers in the writings of the Hebrew Bible. And I love that wording because it comes up in multiple ways. And I want to say, I'm going to give an example that I think might feel really unrelated, but when she says the experiential shimmers, the meaning that I see in that is that metaphor is experienced by human beings as a whole person experience. So in other words, we hear someone say, oh, they grasped the concept. And what's ignited in our brain is not the abstract meaning or idea of grasping something. It's the actual, right? If we have physically grasped the handle of a shovel, for instance, it's going to have more meaning. The abstract phrase will have more meaning, grasped. And so I want to give you an example from a conversation that happened in the grocery store just this week of how certain words, experiences, concepts tend to have very embodied connotations in our mind. So I was with my daughter at Grocery Outlet, which is a place you can buy really wonderful non-dairy desserts at an incredibly discounted price because they're usually about to expire, right? So they've been shoveled off the shelves everywhere else, and we go and we look around and we buy our favorite little treats. So we had found this just treasure trove of this coconut milk based chocolate ice cream and filled up our cart, and we were going through the line, and there was a young man probably about 19 years old, and he kind of noticed, oh, here's this lady with her daughter, right, and their cart is filled with ice cream. And so he told us, I just started working here And he said, when I was a little boy, once a week, I would get to come into grocery outlet and go to the ice cream cabinet and choose something. And he said, this hasn't happened in years, like it had been more than 10 years. But he said when he came to report for his first day of work, he had this visceral memory of being a little child and standing in front of the ice cream cabinet. And so this reality that we carry meanings and connotations associated with physical experiences, we carry them in our bodies. This is really, really important. And the people who research how metaphors work point out all kinds of different things. But one thing that I think is, I want to at least bring to our attention for this discussion is that some people in the last, I don't know, probably 10 years or so have been asking the question, in what order do our brains process metaphor? And some researchers have started to look at tiny, tiny, tiny time gaps. Like, in other words, is the sensory motor portion of our brain being activated before or after the abstract thinking, right? The portion of our brain that moves us from, oh, I grasped the handle of a shovel to I grasped a concept that I learned in history class. And some researchers are saying that when they look at brain scans, they're actually seeing that when we hear an abstract concept spoken in metaphorical language, that the sensory motor portion of our brain lights up a split second, probably even less than a split second, right? Because the time they're measuring is minuscule, but it's absolutely essential that we have those experiences, and out of those experiential things that we carry in our bodies, the metaphorical language means something. It takes on meaning. And so when the Hebrew Bible writers were writing, I simply want to point out that they are drawing on metaphors that have meaning for the people in that world, and that the power of the metaphor is at least in part tied to the experiences that a person has who is hearing the metaphor. So you saw in my title that I said I want to argue that the variety of imagery that we find in the Hebrew Bible is an invitation, at the very least. I could say maybe a demand, but I'll stick with invitation, an invitation to theological humility. And what I mean by the term humility is not self-effacing and anything like that. It is groundedness, like an awareness of our own limitations, an awareness of what we can speak to and what we can't, what the limits of our understanding are. And so I want to point out that one of the reasons it feels so important to me to point out the huge variety of metaphors used in the Hebrew Bible is that it can become really easy to say, well, you know, it's fine that you like imagery, but I like this 3-point doctrinal summary of the truth about God. Okay, and it can become easy to start arguing and saying, well, your idea about God, or about how reality works, or about how the sacred and the human interact, right? The divine human relationship, your idea is just your preference, but I have access to the absolute truth. And we've seen this happen at every phase of human history, right? We could cite examples of this tendency. But in the Hebrew Bible, I love what I have on the screen right now, that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he says there actually is no talking about God without using metaphor. So anytime there's a talk about God, okay, and I would take this even beyond the Bible, right? Anytime humans try to put language to God, to God's activity in the world, to how God relates to humans and how humans might relate to God. We're always having to draw on metaphor. In other words, a transfer. Okay, we're talking about one thing in terms of another. And I have written this another way just to be sure we get what Rabbi Sachs is saying, and that is that there's literally no exception to this. All talk of God is by way of metaphor. So let me share a few. Lauren, I see that. Oh, you're clapping. I thought you were raising your hand to maybe tell me my slides weren't visible in the right way. I'm
really
committing
interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just affirming you. I love the concept that all talk of God is by metaphor. It just seems necessarily so when you say it.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm committing what I know to be a PowerPoint faux pas. You know how they tell us never put lots of words on a PowerPoint, it's distracting and all of that. But I know some people find it helpful to be able to follow along. And I am going to read right now for you a bit of a longer block quote. And this is from a book by William Brown about metaphor. The title of the book, in case anyone is interested in looking at it in the future, is called Seeing the Psalms. And this is what William Brown points out. Brown says, and he's speaking here particularly about the Psalms because he's exploring metaphor in the Psalms. But much of what he says, I think, applies to the use of imagery throughout the Bible. He says the Psalter is at least Scripture's most integrated corpus. On David's many-stringed lyre, as it were, there can be heard almost every theological chord that resounds throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, from covenant and history to creation and wisdom. In the Psalms, the God who commands is also the God who sustains, the God of royal pedigree and the God of the poor and needy, the God of judgment and the God of healing. God's hidden face and God's beaming countenance, all are profiled in the Psalter. Such an eclectic portrayal of the divine is consonant with an equally thick profile of the human self. The public and private spheres, corporate worship, and inner devotion find their nexus in the Psalms. From anger to adulation, the various Psalms cover the gamut of human emotion and response to God's presence in the world, or lack thereof. All that is humanly experienced is related to God, knowledge of self and knowledge of God. And here he starts talking about John Calvin's use of those categories. But he says, and I love this wording, okay, with its jagged edges, yet luminous intensity, the Psalter presents the rich mosaic of faith, pieced together from Israel's turbulent history and cultural diversity. The Psalms, he says, at once caress and assault the soul. They orient, disorient, and reorient. They scale the heights of praise as well as plumb the depths of despair. So Brown is really pointing out here how in the Psalms, the variety of language that's used requires us to allow each bit of imagery, each way of speaking about or to or with God, to be one piece of a bigger picture. But he really then argues by extension that if we take one tile and we make it the whole picture, we are actually not only doing a disservice, but actually distorting the picture. So the next thing that I want to point out is that, you know, there has been a tendency to think of metaphor as like a fancy way to say something that could be said in other words. And one summary of this comes from a woman who's writing on metaphor. I love her last name is Feinstein, and she says, metaphor was once regarded solely as an ornamental linguistic device, And she's speaking here about like education in America. So she says, for instance, it was taught in English classes as a component of figurative language, along with simile and analogy. Now, she says, metaphor is considered by many theorists and researchers to be central to the construction of meaning. So the use of metaphor then is it matters, and our attention to it matters, because it's not just an option, right? Something that we can choose to draw on or not to help make a point or make our language sound fancier, but it is actually tied to our construction of meaning. And that process is something that we're all involved in one way or another, whether that's within our awareness or not. So the next person's work on this that I want to bring to your attention is Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson has a beautiful little book about the Psalms, and it's called Answering God. Certainly not a new book. It's been out for decades. But part of the reason that I am arguing that it's important for us to keep in mind the broad mosaic of metaphors in the Hebrew Bible is because it helps us to relate to one another with kindness and curiosity and care, rather than with rigidity and with a sense that if you don't prefer the same metaphor for God that I prefer, then you belong in the community less than I belong in the community. So Peterson talks about metaphor, and he makes some sort of comparisons when he's talking about metaphor, and specifically when he is trying to say that if we boil down, and Brown says the same thing, and I'll share that quote with you in a bit, but they both point out that if we ever insist on using one metaphor and insist that we can't use another one, that it is idolatry, okay? But this, what I have on the screen right now is Eugene Peterson's summary of this. And he says, in comparison to an idol that reduces and confines, a metaphor expands and connects. In comparison to an idol, he says something that starts with a mystery and fashions it into something that can be measured. A metaphor begins with something common, and then it expands into, and I love his flowery language in this context, immeasurable glory. If any of you have ever sat with a relatively large group of people to unpack a biblical metaphor, you might get a sense of what Peterson is talking about here, because the beauty of unpacking imagery and all the possible connotations that a given image from everyday life can bring up for people, you find out that it is absolutely incredible, the depths. Like, it's one thing to read a text like, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, something like that is using this metaphor of water, flowing water. It's one thing to read that yourself and kind of think of all the meanings that could be associated with that imagery of flowing water, but to read it with a group of 35 people and start collecting all of the connotations and the symbolism that people have connected for them to the idea of flowing water, the experience of flowing water, it becomes an incredible experience. Okay, another point that Peterson makes about metaphor is that he says, an idol gathers divinity into a lump, sometimes a very elegant and finely crafted lump, but a lump nevertheless that can be controlled. And he contrasts that with a metaphor that puts materiality into speech. So in other words, the physical experience that we can have in our everyday life, puts that into the spoken word, okay? And because it's based on experience, and there's such variety of experiences, that it isn't under control, okay? So that our amount of control actually diminishes when we use something as a metaphor. It is subject, he says, to the spontaneous dynamics of conversation. And here, the part of this point that I think is really meaningful to me from Peterson is that not only is there a spontaneous dynamic like what I described a moment ago, where if you gather with a group of people, you all build together around the connotations you have associated with a given image or experience. But Peterson is saying that God, the living God, is a partner in this conversation. And so this takes me to another example. Hold on, let me see what slide I have up here next, because I don't have a slide for this. Nope. Okay, I'll leave it right here. This takes me to the story in the Hebrew Bible that I think is important to me in the idea of God being a partner in this dynamic emerging process. And that is just the way God speaks to Moses in the story of the bush that was on fire but not consumed. That when Moses asks, like, who are you? And Moses is not satisfied with the answer, well, I'm the God of your fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses keeps pushing, and God is described there in this story that becomes, in a way, the explanation, the etiological tale that helps us understand the name Yod-He, Vav-He, for this personal God of ancient Israel and Judah. And God responds by saying, essentially, I will be who I will be. In other words, I am in relationship with the created world, with humanity, and this relationship is emerging, and it's formed by the people and situations that I'm engaging with, and therefore there is no boxed up tidy little package that I can give you that encapsulates God or mystery or the divine. So the idea of God as a living partner in this emerging conversation feels important, and like it flows out of a number of the foundational stories we find in the Hebrew Bible. So this is the quote that I mentioned to you, that is really William Brown saying something very similar to what Peterson was saying. So Brown, in that same book, he says, when metaphors become literalized to the point that they exclude other metaphors for the same subject or target domain, particularly in the case of God, they function as idols. Put theologically, if any metaphor, no matter how profound, becomes absolutized, as though it were itself considered ultimate, idolatry becomes the norm. So just to give you a sense of, I don't know how much I want to say right here, but just to give you a sense of this, let me just list off a few, okay? And this is only a tiny representation, but let's say in the Hebrew Bible, God is described as a potter, a shepherd. In the New Testament, God is described as a vine and as bread. Okay, in the Hebrew Bible, God is a rock, and God is a shield, and God is an eagle, and God is the sun. God is a father, God is a mother, God is both a nursing mother and a birthing mother. God is a lion, a lamb. And if we take even just a very short list of metaphors like this, and then we just think for a moment about social dynamics in contexts of religious discussions, there's often a sense in which, and I'm working now as a professor of sociology, and so I'm having lots of opportunities to teach my students about social sanctions. But if you take it, whatever language you want to use for it, we reward certain language for God, and we don't reward or even, give negative reactions to other language for God. And most communities will have preferences. Like if you use certain language for God, it's acceptable and rewarded. And if you use the language that is not part of that set, then there are negative responses. And it can be anything from a raised eyebrow to outright saying, oh, we can't let this person talk to us about their imagery for God because it's dangerous. So this that Brown is pointing out, I would say, plays out in all kinds of communities in all different ways, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very explicit. So going to the, let's say, mystical part of Jewish tradition, we find this phrase: if you want to use metaphor, use many metaphors. In other words, don't ever settle for a single set of imagery. And this would go for talking about God or talking about other aspects of reality, that we're always missing part of the picture. And invariably, because how I mentioned at the beginning that I'm really fascinated by the research being done in the last 10 years or so about, like in neuroscience, about how our brains actually process metaphor. And I have mentioned to a number of groups this idea that if we have a physical experience of the metaphor being used, that really makes it possible for us to then make sense of the abstract use. Okay, so if I have kicked a rock, right, and felt that on my toe, or if I have taken refuge in a castle by the side of the road and found protection there for the night, then when I read God is my fortress, or God is my rock, or God is this or that, it has a meaning that is coming out of my experience. And some people have pointed out how then there are some metaphors that are timeless, because perhaps there's an aspect of that part of human experience that is common, but that there are some metaphors that may be tied to certain socio-historical, socio-political, even geographical places, that certain imagery might have a lot more meaning for some communities than another. And people often bring up the question then, in what ways is it our responsibility as people making up spaces where the divine is spoken about in reference to human experience, which is all talk of the divine is in reference to human experience. In what way is it our responsibility to be at least open, if not actively engaged, in creating new metaphors, or in finding language that will be meaningful in the communities in which we find ourselves? So Rabbi Tova Spitzer, she writes beautifully about some of the different metaphors found in the Hebrew Bible. And she says, once upon a time, our ancestors employed a rich palette of metaphors to shape their experiences of the divine. Metaphors that spoke directly to their everyday experiences. My hope, she says, is that we can recapture the aliveness which once pervaded our holy texts and reconstruct our metaphors so that they are once again engaging and meaningful. So I don't know exactly how long you wished for me to present and when you want to transfer to a discussion, but I want to at least point out these, which for me are the main points that I am hoping to get across in the argument that if we pay attention to the variety of metaphors in the Hebrew Bible, or you can expand that, right? You could expand it to the whole Bible. You could expand it to the variety of metaphors we use in our various religious communities. That this is going to allow us to do a few different things. One of those is to maintain an awareness of mystery. In other words, that we don't ever need to come to a point where we have our 5 little points that are all laid out and we're ready to tell other people, oh, we have arrived. We know about God. We know how God interacts with humanity, and we know what humans need to do. And here are the 5 points. Therefore, it's all done and we can move on to other endeavors. So being aware of the huge variety of metaphors in the Hebrew Bible makes us, or it allows us, let me use more invitational language, it allows us to maintain an awareness of mystery. I saw somebody put into the chat a few minutes ago, like, what is a good metaphor for God? And that's such an interesting question, because you could say every metaphor in the Hebrew Bible could be, in some circumstances, a good metaphor for God, and yet every single metaphor is incomplete. So all could serve a purpose, all could be healing in one circumstance and maybe even harmful in another circumstance, but taken together, they give us this bigger picture, all these tiles in a mosaic that reveals a bigger image. And we catch glimpses of that bigger image by somehow cultivating an openness of heart that allows us to learn from other people and what metaphors are most healing and helpful for them. And I would say also, cultivating an openness to saying, hey, if this metaphor is harmful, even if it's my personal favorite, I'm open to hearing about that. So the other thing that I think is important is, I want to see, I feel like there was one more quote I wanted to read in regard to the mystery. I'll come back to it if I remember it. But the question of integration, I feel like, is another part of why an awareness of our use of metaphor feels important to me. And this first came to my mind in a conversation where I was watching an interview with a famous music artist, performing artist. And they were talking, that the interview was part of a collective trauma healing online conference. And so all the presentations were all about healing of trauma in one way or another. But this musician and performing artist was talking about metaphor as being healing because it helps us integrate. So if we think of trauma as being like a separation, something gets separated, whether it's an experience that we can't metabolize at the time it happens to us, or a part of ourselves we shut off and separate and exile because we can't bring it in to our current experience, then imagery, metaphor, especially metaphors for God, for what it means to be human and live well in the world, for the divine human, or even human to like physical world relationships, can be an incredible tool for integration. Okay, and I believe this is true personally, that we can heal personally by allowing ourselves to release metaphors that are painful and to embrace metaphors that create that kind of healing space for us. And the other part of the collective aspect of integration is that there's a sense in which when we gather in spaces with multiple people together and we're talking about God and about the divine human relationship, if we make a habit of using a lot of different metaphors, I think it just is more hospitable. I mean, let's think, I like to flip this when I talk about use of primary metaphors. So just imagine this. Imagine if you were deeply harmed by your mother, okay? Abused by your mother, abandoned by your mother. And then you went to a church where they always talked about God is a mother. They always use the pronoun she for God. And there were no options, no alternative metaphors were ever used. Then you could sit in that community and feel not only a deeper awareness of your own pain that you're carrying with you, but also maybe a gap, maybe a lack of ability to hear what people are trying to say, because you're checking out just to survive, kind of the feelings that come up with that. Okay. And so when I say that metaphor, paying attention to, attending to, intentionally investing in this huge variety of metaphor, it allows us to integrate collectively. I'm also arguing that I think that it can create a healing environment for a wider variety of people if there's an intentionality about using a variety of metaphors for God and for the divine human relationship. I also want, one of the things that I'm trying to communicate when I examine this is that attending to this variety of metaphors allows us to collaborate with one another. And I'm looking down at my phone because I want to give you an example. And I'm shamelessly plugging my sister's writing right now. So my sister has been writing for a couple of years now, blessings, very short blessing poems. And I want to share one of these with you as an example of what I mentioned earlier. So I mentioned earlier, if you sit down with a group of people, it's pretty amazing to realize all the different connotations associated with a given set of imagery. And you can leave with a really expanded and deepened sense of all the possible implications or symbolic meanings of that image. So I want to read to you this short blessing written by my sister. If maybe I'll put her handle into the chat in case anyone is interested in. Let's see if I can figure out how to. Oh, here we go. Okay, so she writes at Jesus, my favorite subject, on Instagram and Facebook, and has a blog, but this is her blessing, and she's writing about raindrops. Okay. And this is just one, right? Rain is just one of the metaphors out of these countless metaphors used in the Bible. But this is her poem. She says, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, for raindrops, pesky on glasses, risky on a white t-shirt, frisky as they land with a splash in roadside puddles. Blessed are you for the wideness of meaning in a raindrop. Hope, the end of drought. Fear, a tropical storm. Irritation, picnic at the park. Boredom, a long and rainy spring. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, for the elegance of raindrops. Their tidy round wetness, highlighting beauty as they pause on blades of grass, bluebird feathers, rose petals, pine needles, or dangle from the tiniest twig. How do they hold on without fingers?" So this is just one person's little short poem unpacking the image of a raindrop. Okay, but imagine if in our religious communities we could sit with one another and we could take a bit of imagery that the biblical text offers us and allow for this huge variety of connotations to be brought into that space that we're sharing, and then allow with open, hospitable hearts to kind of allow ourselves to soak in the implications that those various connotations have for making sense of who is God, how does God relate to us as humans, how might we relate to one another, and how might we relate in healing and hopeful ways with the earth. So I believe attending to the variety of metaphors allows us to collaborate with care and creativity. And I might, expand on that and just say, without feeling threatened by people who, have different preferences for metaphors, or who for them have different connotations associated with a given metaphor. The other thing that I allow that I think looking at the variety of metaphors allows us to do is to engage in ongoing dialogue. And this goes right back to in a way what I was saying about not only being mindful, being open to know how our use of metaphors lands for the people that we are in community with, but also being open and intentional about understanding our engagement with the divine as an unfolding, emerging relational space that we have the honor of being part of being witnesses to and being part of. And so thinking of that emerging space that the divine is entering, human relational space, and we as humans get a chance to be co-creating this relational space that is co-created by us and other humans and also by the divine, that is something that can really be brought out into the open, into our conscious, by being aware of how metaphor is being used in our communities. And the last thing that I would say here on this list, and then I'm going to just shut off this PowerPoint and say a couple of more words, is that looking at all these metaphors, I think also, and this kind of ties into my use of the word collaborative, but I think it allows us to embrace multiplicity. Like in my sister's poem, right? That raindrops can bring up a sense of abundance and care, and it can also bring up a sense of worry or panic, right? If we've just planned a huge picnic and now it's raining and we suddenly have to figure out what we're going to do. So embracing multiplicity, not only in the sense that the same image can bring up multiple embodied experiences for a single person. So I could experience maybe despair and hope simultaneously, but then that is then multiplied when we gather in community with certain imagery, that also within a community there's a multiplicity of experiences. And I will close by sharing a quote for you from a book that I found really, really beautiful. This is from Yolanda Pierce's book called In My Grandmother's House. It's a beautiful book about all different aspects of church life, family life, etc. But it's a way for me to give you one very particular example of what I'm saying more broadly, that our use of metaphor matters. Okay, and then I'm going to give you a suggestion for some Google searches you could do. I didn't put the images from this up on the screen because I am not an art historian and didn't have the scholarly background to label them properly. But first, let me share this quote, okay? This is from Yolanda Pierce. She says, "Our limited human language fails in our efforts to describe God and God's love for us. We struggle to articulate the complexities of our faith, and so we draw on imagery from ordinary life to explain the extraordinary. We grope for words, sensing our inadequacy to summarize the mysteries of the faith. Yet, it is problematic when symbolic language," here she gives examples of blackness and whiteness, master and slave, soldier and battle, become the default without any acknowledgement that there are real people and weighty historical context underneath the metaphors. Words matter. Symbols are heavy, laden with meaning and history. If whiteness becomes a stand-in for all things holy and pure, it is only a short leap to whiteness being equivalent to godliness. So I share that example, and I invite you also to, if you're interested, do just a bit of exploring of imagery. One example that I find very telling is if you take the image of God as the lamb. So we have in the Bible the Lamb of God. And this started to be used in art, decorating churches, in quite a benign way, right? There would be a beautiful mosaic or maybe a gold foiled painting of a lamb that was centered in the decorations of a church. And if you look at some of these examples, pretty soon you have images of the Lamb of God carrying a crusader flag flying behind them and standing on the bodies of people, okay? Or standing on, in other words, the Lamb of God is now trampling on some places or some people in order to carry the victory flag. And a couple years ago, I had an opportunity to be part of a seminar group, which was, it basically meant there were about 20 scholars from the fields of theology and psychology. And I was like the biblical studies person. And we got together and had conversations. And I specifically remember one of the theologians who I think works as a philosophy teacher, actually, she said, you know, we tend to talk about the human brain using a lot of language taken from computers, okay, the hardware and the software and this and that. She said, what if we decided we would talk about the human brain using garden analogies? Cultivating the soil, creating the space for this to grow or that to grow, adjusting as needed as the growth is taking place. And I remember thinking when she said that, just going back to what Yolanda Pierce says, that our words matter. And I would expand on that to say our choice, all reading is interpretation. Even when we're reading the Bible, all reading is interpretation. And our choice of what metaphors to emphasize has incredible implications for our behavior. I'm thinking as a parent of a young child, how much the war analogy is used in children's songs. Children are constantly taught song lyrics, telling them to go out and, you know, be soldiers for God. And, you know, you go and do it until you die, or until a lot of other people die. And how many children's songs are sung to our little ones about God as the one who plants and cultivates and grows and holds and walks beside and cries with. Maybe those things are mentioned, but not nearly at the level that God as king and battle person are given. So all this to say, words matter, imagery matters, and it has tremendous implications. What we choose to emphasize has tremendous implications for our behavior and the way that our children and our grandchildren make sense of not only who God is, but how they can thrive in the world and what it looks like to be, part of the whole system thriving, right? The God relation to humans and human relation to each other and human relation to the earth. So maybe I'll stop there. It's been about an hour and we'll see what people would like to talk about.